When billionaire Alexander Bennett catches a young boy stealing bread from his restaurant, he discovers he's actually his long-lost son, abandoned with his brother and mother 15 years ago by Alexander's controlling parents. Now he must fight to protect his newfound family and redefine what true wealth really means. But before we continue with this heartwarming story, don't forget to hit subscribe and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from today. Alexander Bennett stood at the window of his penthouse office, staring down at the city below. At 50 years old, he had everything money could buy, but his life felt empty. His assistant knocked on the door, interrupting his thoughts with another stack of contracts to sign. "Mr. Bennett, the board meeting starts in 10 minutes, she reminded him. He nodded without turning around. Another day, another deal. That's all his life had become. The newspapers called him the king of real estate. But what good was a kingdom when you had no one to share it with? His phone buzzed with a message from his security team at one of his restaurants downtown. There had been reports of theft, someone stealing bread early in the mornings. Normally, he wouldn't bother with such a minor issue, but something made him want to handle this personally. "Cancel my meetings for tomorrow morning," he told his assistant. "I need to take care of something." The next day, Alexander arrived at his restaurant before dawn. He waited in his car, watching through the security cameras on his phone. Right on schedule, a small figure darted from the alley toward the delivery entrance. This time, Alexander was ready. He got out of his car and followed the shadow down the alley. His expensive shoes clicked against the pavement as he walked faster, determined to catch the thief. When he turned the corner, he found himself face to face with a young boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. The boy clutched a loaf of bread to his chest, his clothes dirty and torn. His eyes were wide with fear, but there was something else in them that made Alexander freeze, something familiar. "Daddy, I'm hungry," the boy whispered, his voice trembling. Alexander stepped back, shocked. "What did you say?" "Leave him alone," another voice called out. A teenager, maybe 14, emerged from the shadows. He put himself between Alexander and the younger boy. "Tommy, get behind me." "I'm not going to hurt him," Alexander said, raising his hands. "But you can't keep stealing from my restaurant." "We don't have a choice," the older boy said defiantly. "I'm James, and that's my brother Tommy. We do what we have to do to survive." Alexander looked at them more carefully now. Their faces were dirty, but there was pride in the way James held himself, protecting his little brother. Tommy peeked out from behind James, still clutching the bread. "Where are your parents?" Alexander asked, his voice softer now. "None of your business," James snapped. "Come on, Tommy, we need to go." "Wait," Alexander called out. Something inside him wouldn't let him just walk away. "Let me at least buy you a proper breakfast, no strings attached." James hesitated, but Tommy's stomach growled loudly in the quiet morning air. "Please, James," Tommy pleaded. "I'm so hungry." Alexander led them to a nearby diner, watching as the boys devoured plates of eggs, pancakes, and bacon. They ate like they hadn't had a real meal in days. Maybe they hadn't. "Where are you staying?" Alexander asked again. James stared at his plate. "Here and there, we manage." "They're living in the old warehouse on Pine Street," Tommy blurted out, "with the other kids." "Tommy," James hissed. Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in years: responsibility. These boys needed help, and he had more resources than he knew what to do with. "I have a proposition for you," he said carefully. "I have a big house, plenty of room. You could stay there at least until we figure something out better." "Why would you help us?" James asked suspiciously. "What's in it for you?" Alexander looked at Tommy, who was licking syrup off his fork. "Maybe I'm tired of being alone in that big house. Maybe I want to do something good for once." "We don't need charity," James insisted. "It's not charity," Alexander replied. Got a business arrangement. You two stay in school, follow some basic rules, and you get a safe place to live. Deal?" Tommy grabbed James's arm. "Please, James, I'm tired of being cold." James looked at his little brother, then back at Alexander. "First sign of anything weird, and we're gone." "Fair enough," Alexander agreed. That night, as Alexander showed the boys to their rooms, real bedrooms with clean sheets and warm blankets, he felt something changing inside him. The house that had felt so empty for so long suddenly felt different. Tommy ran into his room, jumping on the bed with excitement. "This is amazing! Look, James, there's a bathroom with hot water." Even James couldn't hide his amazement at the size of the rooms. Alexander watched from the doorway as the boys explored their new space, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. Later, As he sat in his study, Alexander pulled up his phone and looked at a picture he'd taken of the boys at dinner. There was something about Tommy's smile, about James's determined expression, that nagged at his memory. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just chance. He opened his laptop and began searching through old employee records. Something about these boys felt familiar, and Alexander Bennett hadn't built his empire by ignoring his instincts. Section 2. Adjusting to a new life. The first few weeks with Tommy and James were like nothing Alexander had ever experienced. Every morning, he woke up to the sounds of life in his once quiet mansion. Tommy's laughter echoed through the halls, and even James's cautious footsteps were a reminder that he wasn't alone anymore. "Mr. Bennett, can I have more cereal?" Tommy asked at breakfast, his bowl already empty. The boy had developed quite an appetite now that he knew food would always be available. "Of course you can, and please call me Alexander," he replied, pushing the cereal box across the table. He noticed James watching their interaction carefully, still suspicious of their new guardian's kindness. Later that morning, Alexander's assistant arrived with paperwork to enroll the boys in school. James tensed up immediately. "School? We can't go to school," James protested. "Who's going to take care of Tommy?" Alexander put down his coffee cup. "That's my job now. You boys need an education." "We don't even have proper clothes," James argued. "Then we'll go shopping," Alexander said simply. This afternoon, the shopping trip was an eye-opening experience for everyone. Tommy couldn't believe he could have new clothes that actually fit him. James tried to pick the cheapest items, but Alexander insisted on quality. "These shoes will last longer," Alexander explained, holding up a pair of sturdy sneakers. "Sometimes, spending more saves money in the long run." "Is that how you got rich?" Tommy asked innocently. Alexander smiled. "Part of it. But the most important thing is taking care of what matters most." As they walked through the mall, Alexander noticed people staring. He knew what they were thinking. What was the famous Alexander Bennett doing shopping for children's clothes? With two scruffy-looking boys? "Mr. Bennett!" a sharp voice called out. Alexander turned to see Margaret Whitmore, one of his board members, approaching with her perfectly manicured nails and designer handbag. "Margaret," he nodded politely. "I didn't know you had visitors," she said, eyeing the boys with barely concealed disdain. "Tommy and James are staying with me," Alexander replied firmly. "They'll be starting school next week." Margaret's eyebrows shot up. "How charitable of you. The board will be interested to hear about this new development." After she walked away, James looked worried. "Are we causing trouble for you?" "No," Alexander said firmly. "Margaret and the board work for me, not the other way around." That evening, as Alexander helped Tommy with his first homework assignment, practicing writing his name, he felt more fulfilled than after any business deal he'd ever closed. "You make your why just like I do," Alexander observed, watching Tommy carefully form each letter. "Really?" Tommy beamed with pride. Later, after the boys went to bed, Alexander returned to his research. He'd been going through old personnel files, focusing on the time period around 14 years ago. Something about James's age and Tommy's familiar features kept nagging at him. He found himself looking at photos of former employees, particularly the domestic staff. That's when he saw her, Sarah Mitchell, a former housekeeper. The dates matched up perfectly. She had worked for his family for 2 years before suddenly disappearing. Alexander remembered her now. She had been young, beautiful, and kind. They had grown close during late-night conversations when he would come home from work. Very close. Until one day she was just gone. His hands shook as he looked at her photo. The same nose as James, the same smile as Tommy. Could it be possible? A noise from the hallway interrupted his thoughts. He found James sneaking down to the kitchen. "Everything okay?" Alexander asked. James jumped. "Sorry, Tommy was hungry. He's still afraid there won't be food tomorrow." "There will always be food," Alexander assured him. "And you don't have to sneak around. This is your home now." "For how long?" James asked quietly. "Everyone leaves eventually." Alexander felt those words in his heart. "Not this time, James. I promise you that." As he helped James make sandwiches for Tommy, Alexander knew he needed to find Sarah. He needed to know the truth, but he also knew he had to be careful. He didn't want to disrupt the fragile trust he was building with the boys. The next morning, he made some calls to private investigators. If Sarah was out there, he would find her. And maybe then he would understand why looking at Tommy felt like looking at his own childhood photos, why James had his mother's determination in his eyes. But for now, he had 2 boys to get ready for their first day of school. Real clothes, backpacks and packed lunches, all the normal things he'd never thought he'd be doing at 50 years old. "Ready for school?" he asked as the boys came downstairs. Tommy ran to give him a hug while James managed a small smile. Progress, Alexander thought. Small steps toward something that felt more and more like family. Section 3. Secrets and Suspicions. 2 months after the boys moved in, Alexander received a thick envelope from the private investigators. He waited until late at night to open it after Tommy and James were asleep. "Mr. Bennett," his head investigator wrote, "we've found some concerning information about Sarah Mitchell." Alexander's hands trembled as he read through the report. Sarah had left town 14 years ago. Right around the time James would have been born, she had moved from city to city, working various jobs to support her children. The investigators had tracked her to a small town 3 hours away, where she was now in a hospital, seriously ill. "What are you reading?" James's voice startled him. Alexander looked up to find James standing in the doorway of his study. The boy had become less hostile over the past weeks, but there was still a wall between them. "James, sit down, I need to tell you something." "Is it about our mother?" James asked quietly. Alexander's surprise must have shown on his face because James continued, "I saw you looking at her picture on your computer the other day. I remember her working here in this house. I was very young, but I remember." "Why didn't you say anything?" Alexander asked. "I wanted to see if you would figure it out yourself," James replied. "Tommy doesn't remember. He was too little when she got sick. But I remember everything." Alexander moved to sit next to James on the couch. "Tell me what happened to her." "She tried so hard to take care of us," James said, his voice cracking. "But then she got sick, really sick. She couldn't work anymore. She sent us to stay with a friend, but the friend couldn't keep us. That's how we ended up on the streets. Do you know where she is now?" James shook his head. "She calls sometimes, when she can, but she hasn't called in months." Alexander took a deep breath. "I know where she is, James, and I need to ask you something very important. Is it possible that I'm your father?" James looked down at his hands. "Mom never told us, but I always wondered. That's why I was so scared when you found us. I thought you might recognize us." A knock at the door interrupted them. Tommy stood there in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "I had a bad dream." Alexander and James exchanged a look. "Come here, buddy," Alexander said, opening his arms. Tommy climbed onto the couch between them. "Why are you both awake?" "We were just talking," James said, putting an arm around his brother. "About Mom." Tommy's eyes widened. "You found her?" Alexander nodded. "She's in a hospital not far from here. She's sick, but she's getting treatment." "Can we see her?" Tommy asked hopefully. "I think it's time we all went to see her," Alexander said. "But first, there's something else we need to do." The next morning, Alexander took the boys to a medical clinic. The DNA test was simple, just a quick swab inside their cheeks, but the implications were enormous. "How long until we know?" James asked as they left the clinic. "A few days," Alexander replied. "But James, no matter what the results say, you and Tommy are part of my life now. Nothing will change that." While they waited for the results, Alexander had his lawyers start preparing paperwork. Custody documents, trust funds, everything the boys would need. He also sent his best doctors to evaluate Sarah's condition. The DNA results arrived on a Tuesday morning. Alexander sat with both boys in his study as he opened the envelope. "Well?" James asked, trying to sound casual, but gripping Tommy's hand tightly. Alexander read the results twice to be sure. "It's positive. I am your father." Tommy jumped up and hugged him. "I knew it. That's why I called you Daddy that first day. You look just like the picture Mom kept." James sat very still, processing the news. "What happens now?" "Now," Alexander said, holding Tommy with one arm and reaching for James with the other, "we go get your mother and bring her home, where she should have been all along." But as they prepared to leave for the hospital, Alexander's phone rang. It was Margaret Whitmore. "The board is calling an emergency meeting," she said, her voice cold. "Your parents are involved. They're saying you're unfit to run the company. Something about hiding a scandal from years ago." Alexander felt a chill. His parents, of course. They must have found out about the boys. The same parents who had forced Sarah to leave all those years ago, paying her off to disappear. "When's the meeting?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning. And, Alexander, they have documentation, letters, agreements, proof of payments to Sarah Mitchell. They're going to use this to take everything from you." Alexander looked at his sons, as they got ready to go see their mother. He had spent his whole life building his empire, but now, facing the possibility of losing it all, he realized something. He had finally found something worth more than all his wealth. "Let them try," he told Margaret. "Some things are worth fighting for." Section 4. Facing the Past. Alexander walked into the board meeting the next morning, with his head held high. The large conference room fell silent as he entered. At the head of the table sat his parents, Richard and Eleanor Bennett, looking as cold and polished as ever. "Son," Richard said, his voice dripping with fake concern, "we're here to discuss your recent irregular behavior." "You mean taking in my sons?" Alexander replied firmly. "The grandsons you tried to hide from me?" Eleanor's perfectly made-up face tightened. "We did what was best for the family name. That girl was nobody, a housekeeper trying to trap you for your money." "That girl is the mother of my children," Alexander's voice rose. "And you paid her to disappear, you threatened her." Margaret Whitmore cleared her throat. "We have documentation showing that Sarah Mitchell accepted a substantial payment to leave town and never contact Alexander again. A payment she only accepted because you threatened to destroy her life if she didn't." Alexander pulled out his own folder. "And I have proof of that too." He spread out documents across the table, copies of threatening letters, recordings of phone calls, testimony from former staff members who had witnessed everything. "You can't prove any of this," Richard sputtered. "Actually, I can. Sarah kept everything. Every letter, every recorded conversation. She was smart. She knew she might need protection someday." The board members murmured among themselves, looking uncomfortable. This wasn't the simple takeover they'd been promised. "Think about what you're doing," Eleanor pleaded. "You're throwing away everything we built for some woman and her children?" "No, Mother. I'm finally doing what I should have done 15 years ago. I'm choosing my family, my real family." Alexander's phone buzzed. It was James. "Dad, Mum's awake. The doctors say she's asking for you." That one word, Dad, made Alexander's heart swell. It was the first time James had called him that. "I'll be right there," he promised. He turned back to the board. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've spent my entire life building this company, but I've learned something recently. Success means nothing if you don't have anyone to share it with." He laid a manila envelope on the table. "These are the names of 3 independent auditing firms. Pick one. Let them go through everything. My records, my parents' records, all of it. I have nothing to hide, do you?" Richard's face turned red. "You wouldn't dare expose the family like this." "Watch me," Alexander said calmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, my family needs me." He walked out of the boardroom, leaving chaos behind him. His phone was already ringing with board members wanting to distance themselves from his parents' scheme. At the hospital, he found James and Tommy sitting beside Sarah's bed. She looked pale and thin, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "Alexander," she whispered. "I'm so sorry. I should have fought harder to tell you." He took her hand. "No, I'm the one who's sorry. I should have looked for you. I should have known something was wrong when you disappeared." "Mom?" Tommy crawled onto her bed. "Are you coming home with us?" Sarah looked uncertainly at Alexander. He smiled. "Of course she is. We're all going home. Together." "But your parents?" Sarah started. "Can't hurt us anymore," Alexander finished. "I've taken care of it." James, who had been quiet, finally spoke up. "So we're really going to be a family? All of us?" "We already are," Alexander said. "We just didn't know it." That evening, as Sarah rested in one of the mansion's guest rooms and the boys played video games nearby, Alexander's phone rang again. It was Margaret. "The board has voted," she said. "Your parents have been removed from their positions, and Alexander, they want to issue a public apology to you and your family." Alexander looked through the doorway at his sons, his amazing, resilient sons, and the woman he had never stopped loving. "Tell them no apology needed," he said. "Just make sure this never happens to another family." After hanging up, he joined his family. Tommy was teaching Sarah how to play his favorite game, while James kept score. The room was filled with laughter, something that had been missing from his life for far too long. "Dad," Tommy called out, "want to play?" Alexander sat down with them, feeling more wealthy than he ever had in his life, not because of his money or his company, but because he finally had what really mattered, a family. Section 5. New Beginnings, Old Wounds. The first month of living together as a family brought both joy and challenges. Sarah was slowly regaining her strength, but years of hardship had taken their toll. Some mornings she could barely get out of bed. Alexander hired the best doctors in the city to help with her recovery. You don't have to do all this, Sarah protested one day as a private nurse checked her vital signs. Yes, I do, Alexander replied softly. I have 15 years to make up for. The boys were adjusting too. Tommy flourished, his nightmares about being hungry becoming less frequent, but James struggled with trust, especially when Alexander's work kept him late at the office. One evening, Alexander came home to find James sitting alone in the dark. Kitchen. Everything okay? Alexander asked, turning on the light. You said you'd be home for dinner, James said, his voice tight. Mum waited as long as she could, but she got tired. Tommy cried. Alexander's heart sank. He'd been dealing with the fallout from his parents' removal from the board, but that was no excuse. I'm sorry, James, I should have called. That's what Dad always says in movies, James replied, right before he leaves again. Alexander sat down across from his son. James, look at me. I'm not going anywhere. You, Tommy, and your mother are the most important people in my life. More important. Glad in your company. Much more important, in fact. Alexander pulled out his phone and made a call. Margaret, starting tomorrow, I'm working from home 3 days a week. Reschedule everything else. James's eyes widened. Really? Really? Now, is there any dinner left? I'm starving. As they warmed up leftovers together, Alexander noticed James relaxing. Small steps, he reminded himself, but not everything was healing so easily. One afternoon, Sarah received a letter that made her hands shake. What is it? Alexander asked, finding her crying in the garden. Your mother, Sarah whispered. She wants to meet the boys. Says she's sorry, that she wants to make amends. Alexander felt anger rise in his chest. After everything they did, people can change, Alexander. Look at you. You're not the same man you were. That's different. I never deliberately hurt anyone, didn't you? Sarah asked gently. You let them send me away. You never looked for me. The truth of her words hit him hard. I was a coward, he admitted. I let them control my life because it was easier than fighting. And now I know what's worth fighting for. He took her hand. What do you want to do about my mother? Sarah looked toward the house where Tommy was doing homework and James was reading. They deserve to know their grandmother, if she's truly changed. But we do it slowly, carefully, and at the first sign of manipulation, she's gone, Alexander finished. I won't let anyone hurt this family again. The next week brought another surprise. Alexander's lawyer called with news about his father. Richard Bennett has signed over his entire stake in the company to your sons, the lawyer explained. He's retiring to Florida and wants no further contact. When Alexander told Sarah, she wasn't surprised. He knows he lost. This is his way of trying to save face. Should we accept it? The money isn't for us, Sarah pointed out. It's for the boys. Maybe they can do some good with it someday. That night, as the family ate dinner together, Alexander made sure to be home on time. He looked around the table with pride. Tommy was telling an elaborate story about his day at school, complete with sound effects. James was actually smiling, adding details to embarrass his little brother. Sarah's cheeks had color again, and her laugh was getting stronger every day. Dad, are you listening? Tommy demanded. Sorry, buddy. Just thinking about how lucky I am. We're the lucky ones, Sarah said softly, reaching for his hand. James cleared his throat. So, there's this father-son camping trip at school next month. Say no more, Alexander grinned. I'll clear my schedule. Can I come too? Tommy bounced in his seat. Of course you can, James said, surprising everyone. You're my brother, aren't you? Later, after the boys were in bed, Alexander found Sarah looking at old photos. I kept every picture, she said. Even when we had nothing else, I made sure they knew where they came from. Alexander wrapped his arms around her. I'm so sorry you had to do it alone. We're not alone anymore, she reminded him. That's what matters now. As they stood there together, Alexander realized that all his years of chasing success had led him right back here, to the family he should have fought for 15 years ago. But maybe, he thought, they all had to take that journey to appreciate what they had now. Section 6. Public Eyes, Private Lives. The story of the Bennett family reunion hit the newspapers on a Tuesday morning. Billionaire's secret family revealed, screamed the headlines. Photographers camped outside their gates, desperate for pictures of the former housekeeper and her sons who were now heirs to one of the city's largest fortunes. I hate this, James said, peeking through the curtains at the reporters outside. Everyone at school is talking about us. Just ignore them, Sarah advised, but she looked worried too. The attention was bringing up old anxieties. Alexander had his security team increased, but he couldn't shield his family from all the gossip. People were especially cruel about Sarah, suggesting she had planned everything from the beginning. "Did you see what they're saying about Mom online?" Tommy asked one evening, his iPad showing a particularly nasty article. Alexander took the tablet away. "None of that matters, we know the truth." But the truth was complicated, as they discovered when Eleanor Bennett finally got her meeting with the family. They met at a private room in Alexander's favorite restaurant, away from prying eyes. "My boys," Eleanor said, tears in her eyes as she saw her grandsons. "You look so much like Alexander when he was young." James stood protectively in front of Tommy. "We're not your boys. You didn't want us, remember?" Eleanor flinched. "I was wrong, so terribly wrong. I let fear of scandal and public opinion override what was right." "Fear?" Sarah spoke up. "You threatened to have me arrested. You said you'd make sure I never worked again." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "I've thought about it every day since. Watching Alexander all these years, so successful but so alone. I did that. I destroyed my son's happiness because I cared more about our social position than his heart." Alexander watched his mother carefully. She looked older, more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," Eleanor continued. "I don't deserve it. I just want a chance to know my grandsons, to try to make up for some of the damage I caused." "That's not just your decision," Alexander said firmly. "James, Tommy, what do you think?" Tommy looked uncertain. "Could we maybe start with ice cream just sometimes?" James was harder to convince. "How do we know you won't try to hurt us again?" Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are legal documents. I'm signing over my remaining shares in the company to a trust for you boys, and I'm making a public statement about what Richard and I did 15 years ago. No more hiding, no more lies." Sarah touched Alexander's arm. "People can change," she reminded him softly. "One chance," Alexander told his mother, "but everything happens on the boys' terms. And if you ever try to cause trouble—" "I won't," Eleanor promised. "I've lost too much to pride already." As they left the restaurant, reporters spotted them. Questions flew. "Mrs. Bennett, are you accepting your son's illegitimate family?" "Sarah, how much money did you ask for to come back?" Before Alexander could intervene, James stepped forward. "My brother and I aren't illegitimate," he said clearly. "We're Bennetts. And our mother never asked for anything except the chance to give us a good life. She worked hard, she protected us, and now we're protecting her. That's what families do." The reporters fell silent, cameras clicking. Tommy grabbed James's hand, standing tall beside his brother. Back home, Alexander found Sarah in tears. "Happy tears," she assured him. "James has grown up so much. They both have. They get that from their mother," Alexander said, pulling her close. But their peace was about to be tested again. That night, Alexander received a call from his private investigator. "Sir, there's something you need to know about your father. He's not in Florida. He's been meeting with your biggest competitors, trying to orchestrate a hostile takeover of the company." Alexander felt his blood run cold. The company was more than just a business. It was his children's inheritance, their future security. "Get me everything you have," he ordered. "And Sarah, we need to talk." "Another crisis?" she asked, seeing his face. "Yes, but this time I'm not facing it alone." He looked at his family, gathered in the living room doing homework and playing games. "We're stronger together." As he sat down to explain the situation to Sarah, Alexander realized something had changed in him. Once, the threat of losing his company would have consumed him. Now, looking at his family, he knew that as long as he had them, he could face anything. The real wealth, he had learned, wasn't in his bank accounts or his buildings. It was right here in this room, in the love that had brought them all back together despite every obstacle. Section 7. The Final Battle. The next morning, Alexander called an emergency family meeting. Even Tommy sat quietly, sensing the seriousness in his father's voice. "Your grandfather is trying to take over the company," Alexander explained. "He's working with our biggest competitors, the Davidson Group." "But why?" Tommy asked. "Doesn't he have enough money?" Sarah squeezed her youngest son's hand. "Sometimes. It's not about money, sweetheart. It's about power and pride." James, who had been studying the business sections of the newspapers lately, spoke up. "The Davidson Group has been trying to buy us out for years, right? They want our new development projects." Alexander nodded proudly. His son had been paying attention. Yes, and your grandfather knows all our weaknesses. He helped build this company. Eleanor, who had been invited to the meeting, looked devastated. I should have known Richard wouldn't just walk away. He's never accepted defeat gracefully. What can we do? James asked. Alexander spread out some papers on the table. We fight, but we do it as a family. Over the next few weeks, the Bennett family worked together like never before. James started attending board meetings with his father, showing a natural talent for business. Tommy used his computer skills to help organize data. Even Sarah, drawing on her years of observing the family business from the inside, provided valuable insights. But Richard Bennett had planned his attack well. One by one, long-time investors started pulling out, frightened by rumors and false reports. The company's stock price began to drop. Dad? James found Alexander in his study late one night, surrounded by financial reports. I have an idea. Alexander looked up, dark circles under his eyes. What is it? Remember how you always say, the most valuable things aren't in bank accounts. What if we showed everyone that? The next day, Alexander called a press conference, but instead of defending himself against Richard's accusations, he announced a new initiative, the Bennett Family Foundation. For years, this company has been focused solely on profit, Alexander told the cameras. But my sons taught me that true wealth lies in helping others. Starting today, 30% of our profits will go to helping homeless families and children in need. The reporters exploded with questions, but James stepped up to the microphone. My brother and I know what it's like to be hungry, to not have a home. We want to make sure other kids don't have to go through that. Sarah watched from the side, tears in her eyes, as Tommy joined his brother and father at the podium. And my mom, Tommy added. She always helped other people even when we had nothing. That's the kind of business we want to be. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. The company's stock price soared as socially conscious investors rushed to support the new direction. The Davidson Group's takeover attempt began to crumble. Richard Bennett made one final move. He showed up at the mansion unannounced. You're destroying everything I built, he accused Alexander, giving away profits to charity. This is a business, not a homeless shelter. No, father, Alexander replied calmly. I'm building something better than you ever imagined. A company, with a heart, a legacy my children can be proud of. They're not even real Bennetts, Richard shouted. They're just some housekeeper's kids. That's where you're wrong, Eleanor stepped forward, surprising everyone. They're more Bennett than you or I ever were. They understand what really matters. Eleanor? Richard stared at his wife. You're taking their side. I'm choosing. Love over pride, she said simply. Something we should have done 15 years ago. Richard looked around the room, at his son standing tall and proud, at his grandsons who faced him without fear, at Sarah who held her head high despite everything he had done to her, and finally at his wife who had chosen family over fortune. His shoulders sagged. I'm too old for this fight, he admitted. The company's yours. Do what you want with it. Grandpa? Tommy spoke up. Would you like to stay for dinner? Mom made pot roast. The simple invitation, offered with a child's innocent hope, seemed to break something in Richard. He sat down heavily in the nearest chair. I've been a fool, he whispered. Yes, Alexander agreed, but you're still family. If you're willing to try, really try, there might be a place for you here. That night, 3 generations of Bennetts sat down to dinner together. The conversation was awkward at times, but it was a start. Later, as Alexander tucked Tommy into bed, his son asked, Did we win, Dad? Alexander smiled. Yes, buddy, we did. But not just because we saved the company. We won because we stayed together, because we fought for what's right. Like a real family. Exactly like a real family. Section 8. Building Bridges. 6 months after Richard's surrender, the Bennett Family Foundation was making headlines for all the right reasons. They had opened 3 homeless shelters and started a scholarship program for underprivileged children. But the biggest challenge wasn't running the foundation, it was bringing the family together. Grandpa's coming to my school play, Tommy announced at breakfast. He promised. Sarah and Alexander exchanged worried looks. Richard had been trying to make amends, but he still struggled to keep his promises. That's wonderful, sweetheart, Sarah said carefully. But remember, sometimes grown-ups have busy schedules. He'll be there, Eleanor insisted, joining them for breakfast, a new routine she had started. I'll make sure of it. James looked up from his phone. The Davidson Group is announcing their new CEO today. Everyone thinks it'll be Michael Davidson Jr. Michael Jr.? Alexander frowned. He was 2 years behind me at boarding school, always had something to prove. That afternoon, at Tommy's school play, Richard arrived 10 minutes early, surprising everyone. He sat stiffly in his seat, still uncomfortable with public family gatherings. "They're all staring at us," he muttered to Eleanor. "Let them stare," she replied. "Our grandson is playing the lead in Peter Pan. That's all that matters." When Tommy flew across the stage on visible wires, nearly tangling himself but recovering with a big smile, Richard did something no one expected. He laughed. A real, genuine laugh that made him sound younger. After the play, Tommy ran to his family, still wearing his Peter Pan costume. "Did you see me fly, Grandpa? Did you?" Richard knelt down, ignoring the creaking in his knees. "You were the best Peter Pan I've ever seen." Later that week, Alexander received troubling news. The Davidson Group was targeting the same neighborhoods where the Bennett Foundation was building shelters, but with luxury development projects. "They're trying to drive up property values," James realized during a family dinner. "The people we're helping won't be able to afford to stay." "Can they do that?" Tommy asked. "It's legal," Alexander sighed. "Unethical, but legal." Richard cleared his throat. "I might know something that could help." Everyone turned to look at him. "Michael Davidson Sr. and we had some dealings years ago. Dealings that weren't exactly above board." "Dad," Alexander warned, "we're not using blackmail." "Not blackmail," Richard insisted. "Just leverage, to convince them to work with us instead of against us." Sarah spoke up. "What if we offered to partner with them? Show them how helping the community can be good for business too." "That's actually a brilliant idea," Richard admitted, looking at Sarah with new respect. The next day, Alexander and James met with Michael Davidson Jr. The younger Davidson was surprised to see James there. "Bringing your son to business meetings now, Bennett?" He smirked. "My son," Alexander emphasized the word, "understands something you don't, that real success isn't just about making money." James opened his laptop and started a presentation. "Our foundation's work has increased property values in every neighborhood we've helped, but in a sustainable way. We're not pushing people out, we're lifting them up." The numbers were convincing. Crime rates down, small businesses thriving, schools improving. Even Michael Jr. couldn't argue with the results. "What are you proposing?" he asked finally. "A true partnership," Alexander said. "Your development experience, our community connections, together we could transform the city." Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Sarah was going through old photos with Eleanor. They had started this weekly ritual as a way to bridge the gap between them. "I remember this day," Eleanor said, pointing to a picture of Alexander as a child. "He was always so serious even then, until he met you." Sarah touched the photo gently. "He's different now, happier." "We all are," Eleanor admitted. "I was so wrong about you, Sarah, about everything." Richard found them later, still looking at photos. He sat down quietly, picking up an album. "I found this in my office," he said gruffly. "Pictures from the company's early days." He opened to a page showing a much younger version of himself teaching Alexander about business. "I thought I was teaching him how to succeed," Richard said quietly, "but he learned more about success from his sons than he ever did from me." Tommy burst into the room. "Dad and James are home, and they're smiling really big." The Davidson partnership had been sealed. But more importantly, when Alexander and James shared their victory, they didn't just talk about contracts and deals. They talked about the families they would help, the communities they would build. That night, Alexander found Sarah in their garden, her favorite place to think. "Happy?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her. "More than I ever dreamed possible," she replied. "Look at our family, Alexander. Your parents playing chess with Tommy, James following in your footsteps but with such a big heart. And you, and me. You're the man I always knew you could be." Inside, they could hear Tommy trying to teach Richard how to play a video game, while Eleanor and James debated the foundation's next project. Their family wasn't perfect. They still had their struggles and disagreements, but they were together, and that, Alexander knew, was worth more than all the business deals in the world. Section 9. Full circle. 1 year to the day after Alexander had first caught Tommy stealing bread, the Bennett family gathered at their first shelter for its anniversary celebration. The old building had been transformed into a warm, welcoming home for dozens of families. "I can't believe how much has changed," Sarah said, watching Tommy help serve food to the children living there. 1 year ago, our boys were on the streets. Alexander squeezed her hand. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Tommy hadn't chosen my restaurant to steal from that morning. It wasn't chance, James said, joining them. I picked it. I'd been watching you for weeks, trying to work up the courage to talk to you. But then Tommy got so hungry. Alexander pulled his son into a hug. You were looking out for your brother, just like always. The celebration was in full swing when Michael Davidson Jr. arrived with unexpected news. The city council approved our joint proposal, he announced. We can start building the affordable housing complex next month. James grinned. See, Dad? I told you he'd come through. Michael looked around the shelter. You know, my father would have hated this. He always said charity was bad for business. And what do you think? Alexander asked. I think... Michael watched as Tommy led a group of kids in a game, everyone laughing. I think maybe it's time for the next generation to do things differently. Eleanor, who had been organizing the kitchen volunteers, called everyone to attention. Time for the surprise. The lights dimmed, and Richard wheeled out a huge cake decorated with a picture of the shelter. But what made Sarah gasp was the announcement written in frosting. Breaking ground, the Sarah Bennett Memorial Hospital wing. Memorial? Sarah looked confused. I'm not dead. Alexander laughed. No, but you inspired it. We're adding a new medical wing to City Hospital, specifically for families who can't afford care. No one should have to choose between medical treatment and feeding their children. Sarah burst into tears and Tommy ran to hug her. Don't cry, Mom. This is happy. It is happy, she assured him. Very happy. But the day held one more surprise. As the party wound down, James asked for everyone's attention. A year ago, I was angry and scared, trying to take care of my brother on my own, he began. I didn't trust anyone, especially not some rich businessman who caught us stealing bread. People chuckled and James continued. But that businessman turned out to be more than just our father. He showed us what it means to be a true Bennett. James pulled out an envelope. So I've made a decision about college. I'm going to study business and social work, a double major, because I want to help run both the company and the foundation. Alexander felt tears in his eyes. James, you don't have to. I want to, James interrupted. Tommy and I grew up with nothing, and now we have everything. But we'll never forget what it felt like to be hungry and scared. I want to make sure other kids don't have to feel that way. Richard stood up slowly. I've been running this company for over 40 years, he said, and I've never been prouder than I am right now, listening to my grandson talk about its future. Eleanor wiped her eyes. Sarah, we spent so many years trying to keep you and the boys away from our family name, but you've brought more honor to it than we ever did. As the sun set outside, Alexander found Tommy sitting alone on the shelter's front steps. Everything okay, buddy? Tommy nodded. I was just thinking about that morning when you chased me down the alley. I was so scared. But then I looked at you and something inside me just knew you were my dad. Really? Yeah, that's why I called you Daddy right away. I'd been dreaming about finding you for so long. Alexander sat down beside his son. I'm sorry. It took me so long to find you. That's okay, Tommy said with the simple wisdom of children. We all found each other when we needed to. Inside, they could hear Sarah laughing at something James had said, while Richard and Eleanor argued good-naturedly about the best way to serve the cake. The sound of their family, whole, happy and healing, drifted out into the evening air. Alexander looked at his youngest son. You know what, Tommy? You're absolutely right. Everything happened exactly when it was supposed to. And we lived happily ever after? Tommy grinned. Alexander ruffled his hair. We're living it right now. Buddy, we're living it right now. Activity 10. Legacy of Love. 5 years had passed since that fateful morning when a stolen piece of bread changed everything. The Bennett mansion was buzzing with activity as the family prepared for a very special day, James's college graduation. Mom, have you seen my tie? James called down the stairs. At 19, he had grown into a handsome young man who looked more like his father every day. Sarah appeared with the tie in question. Right here, sweetheart. The same place you left. It last night. Tommy, now 13 and almost as tall as his mother, was already dressed in his suit. Hurry up, James. Dad says we can't be late to your big speech. James had been chosen as the graduating class speaker, maintaining straight A's while working part-time at both the family company and foundation. His thesis on combining business success with social responsibility had already caught national attention. Alexander watched his family with pride. Sarah had fully recovered her health and now ran the day-to-day operations of the Bennett Foundation. Her natural compassion and first-hand experience made her perfect for the role. "Everyone ready?" Eleanor called out. She and Richard had sold their own mansion years ago, moving into a comfortable house nearby. They spent most of their time at Alexander's anyway, making up for lost years with their grandsons. "Almost," Richard answered, adjusting his own tie. The years had softened him considerably. These days he was more likely to be found playing video games with Tommy than arguing about business. At the graduation ceremony, James took the podium. With confidence. "5 years ago I was a scared kid living on the streets, trying to protect my little brother. Today I stand before you not just as a graduate, but as someone who has learned life's most valuable lesson, that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in love." Alexander squeezed Sarah's hand as they listened to their son speak. She wiped away tears as James continued. "My father taught me that business success means nothing if you don't use it to help others. My mother showed me that real strength lies in never giving up on love. My brother reminded me to keep faith in miracles. And my grandparents proved that it's never too late to change and choose love over pride." In the audience, Michael Davidson Jr. sat with his own family. The Davidson-Bennett partnership had transformed the city, creating affordable housing communities that were now being copied across the country. After the ceremony, the family gathered at the mansion for a celebration. The house was filled with people, foundation volunteers, families from the shelters, business partners who had become friends. "Speech!" Tommy called out, and everyone turned to Alexander. Alexander looked around at his family, at Sarah, more beautiful than ever with a few silver strands in her dark hair, at James, who would soon start his career combining his father's business sense with his mother's heart, at Tommy, growing into a teenager who never lost his ability to see the good in everyone, at his parents, who had learned that love was more important than social status. "5 years ago," Alexander began, "a little boy stole a piece of bread from my restaurant. He looked up at me with hungry eyes and called me Daddy. That moment changed everything. It led me back to the love of my life," he smiled at Sarah, "and to the family I didn't know I was missing." He raised his glass. "To James, I couldn't be prouder of the man you've become. To Tommy, who reminded me how to believe in magic. To my parents, who proved that love can heal old wounds. To Sarah, my heart, my home, my everything. And to everyone here who has been part of our journey." Later that night, after the guests had gone home, the family sat in the garden where Sarah and Alexander often went to talk. "What happens now?" Tommy asked. "Now," Alexander said, "we keep building. James will join the company. You'll finish school. The foundation will grow. But most importantly, we'll do it together." Sarah leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Remember that morning in the alley, when you caught Tommy stealing bread?" "Best thing that ever happened to me," Alexander said. "To all of us," Eleanor added softly. Richard cleared his throat. "You know, I spent most of my life thinking success meant having the biggest company, the most money. But watching this family, seeing what you've built together, that's real success." James smiled at his brother. "It all started with you, Tommy, your hungry little self stealing that bread." "Maybe it was meant to be," Tommy said thoughtfully. "Maybe we were always supposed to find each other again." Alexander looked at his family, the ones he had lost, and found the ones who had forgiven and been forgiven, the ones who had taught him what really mattered in life. "You know what?" he said. "I think you're right, Tommy. Some things are just meant to be." And there in the garden where so many family conversations had taken place, the Bennetts sat together under the stars, their story having come full circle. From a piece of stolen bread to a legacy of love, they had discovered that the greatest wealth in life wasn't found in bank accounts or business deals, but in the simple, profound blessing of family. Sarah looked at her husband, the man who had once been too busy for love, now surrounded by the family he treasured above all else. "We did good, didn't we?" "We did perfect," Alexander replied, pulling her close as their sons bickered playfully, and their parents watched with contentment. Above them, the stars twinkled like scattered diamonds, but the real treasures were right there in that garden, a family bound together by love, forgiveness, and the destiny that had brought them all back home. The end.